Many of you may have heard the name Elijah Barron, or perhaps you saw his story on the ABC Evening News. He's an 18-year-old who was diagnosed during his junior year of high school at Liverpool High School with osteosarcoma, a type of bone cancer. After going through all kinds of therapy during his senior year, he was excited about his senior ball. But unfortunately, just before the prom, he had to return to the hospital. He was in such pain, and the doctors would not allow him to go to his prom. So what happened? Well, 20 of his classmates took the prom to him at Golisano Children's Hospital, complete with selfie booths and dancing, tuxedos, formal gowns, and a sit-down dinner. He was dressed in his tuxedo. It was one of his best days. And the very next week, he surprised his classmates by walking across that stage to pick up his diploma. David Muir on ABC News used this story as a story of strength. We can certainly understand it as a story that lives out our gospel message this weekend to love your neighbor. A challenge that so often today gets lost in the chaos of our us versus them society. It seems that back in the 1960s, our culture began to embrace a hyper-individualistic way of life that has certainly put a crack into our neighborliness. We moved out of our tight communities with prescribed social norms, living further apart from one another, socially, emotionally, even physically. And the statistics today tell us that 35% of Americans over the age of 45 are chronically lonely, that only 8% report having meaningful conversations with their neighbors, that in our society today, in our culture today, there is a sense of general detachment. Isn't it interesting that the fastest growing political group is unaffiliated, and the fastest growing religious group is unaffiliated? Our suicide rate in the US has risen 30%. Opioids kill 72,000 people every year. We might have hundreds of Facebook friends, but we don't have to interact with them in person. So haven't we lost a sense of neighborliness? And what is going on in our culture today? Arthur Brooks, former professor at SU, presents a very interesting theory in his book called Love Your Enemies. He writes about our culture being a culture of contempt and tells us that in our culture, many people see their neighbors as enemies. They don't think like us, look like us, believe as we believe, so they become enemies. And because of this, Brooks writes that we hold these people in contempt. We don't just disagree with them. We're not just angry at the positions they might take, but we find them contemptuous. The great philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, he defines contempt as the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of another. This is so dangerous, and this is so contrary to the gospel message of Jesus that we just heard, to love our fellow human beings, and even contrary to our Constitution that tells us all are created equal. We don't have to agree with one another, but when we begin to see those who we disagree with or are different from us as enemies and worthless, not human, not deserving our compassion or kindness, we've lost the message of the gospel. We've lost what Jesus came to truly tell us all about, and we've even lost the values that our nation has been founded upon. So I ask all of us this weekend, are we not exhausted by this culture of contempt? This culture of mocking and shaming and personally excluding people from our relationships by belittling and humiliating and ignoring. You know, anger basically says, I don't agree with you on this topic. I have strong feelings about it. I can feel angry. Contempt says, you disgust me. You are beneath caring about. And that gets us nowhere. It has left us as a people stuck in us versus them, resulting in hostile humor and sarcasm, and even where families don't speak to other family members anymore because we can't agree. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, wrote this. He wrote, "To love is to will the good of the other." And Michael Novak, the great philosopher, added to this. He said, "To love is to will the good of the other as other." We are called to love the other. We are called by this gospel to will the good of the other. We're definitely not called to see each other, our neighbors, those who disagree with us, as the enemy. We can disagree without feeling contempt or seeing the other as worthless. So what about each one of us this weekend? The questions we all need to ask ourselves. How do I perceive my neighbor? Do I hold certain people in contempt? Do I see certain people as worthless? And do I shame, belittle, tear down, humiliate those who do not agree with me? How do I love my neighbor? Because us versus them is not working. Nothing happens. So somehow we need to come to the ability to see those who think differently, have different ideologies, political systems, as people who happen to see contentious issues different than we do. But they don't have to be our enemies. So I believe the gospel this weekend challenges us to be respectful of differences and to struggle to listen to each other. Wasn't it refreshing if you were able to turn on ABC News and see David Muir telling the story of kids right in our own neighborhood who gave us such an amazing example of how it is to care for one another?